Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Karen Sander, and I'm the Director of Public Programming for the Graduate Center. Thank you so much for coming out to this evening, focusing on contemporary Middle Eastern art, featuring Aileen Agopian and David Joselit. I don't know if a lot of you have been here at the Graduate Center before, but just to tell you a little bit about what we do here, we are the principal doctoral granting institution of the CUNY system. We have close to 4,000 PhD students enrolled here, and our students teach over 250,000 students at the various CUNY campuses across the 5 boroughs. We are also a center for research with over 30 different centers and institutes under our roof here, and a platform for performance, conversation, and public debate. We are a community of faculty, students, and staff committed to the idea that learning is a public good, so we regularly offer a robust slate of diverse public programs featuring eminent scholars, writers, artists, leaders, and thinkers, and we hope you'll come back for some more of our events. Tonight, the Graduate Center's Department of Public Programs and our renowned Middle East and Middle Eastern American Center is happy to be partnering with New York Live Arts as part of their Live Ideas Festival, which this year focuses on cultural transformations in the Middle East and North Africa. The festival is spanning over many weeks and includes performances, talks, and workshops. I encourage you to get one of the festival brochures on your way out, as there are still many upcoming events that you will not want to miss. We thank our partners at NYLA, particularly Tommy Kriegsman, Director of Programming, and of course, New York Live Arts Artistic Director Bill T. Jones, for all their work in putting together the festival and partnering with the Graduate Center on several of the events. While much of the festival is focused on performance, we are here tonight to delve into contemporary visual art from the Middle East, and we are delighted to have with us Aileen Agopian and David Joselit. A few words about our speakers. Aileen is an expert purveyor of Middle Eastern and North African contemporary art. She worked at Sotheby's from 2011 to 2015 and was essential to the success of its record-breaking auction in Doha. She's conducted sales for Sotheby's worldwide and has also overseen auctions in Los Angeles, Chicago, London, Kuwait, and Beirut. Previously, Agopian worked at White Cube Gallery in London and Phillips, New York. Currently, she is principal at Agopian Associates Art Advisory. David Joselit is a professor of art history here at the Graduate Center with a focus on contemporary global art. Previously, David worked as a curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston and served as the chair of the art history department at Yale. He is also a frequent contributor to Art Forum. Before I bring Aileen up to the stage, just a word about our format for tonight. Aileen is going to give a presentation with images for about 30 minutes, and then she'll be joined on stage by David Joselit for conversation for about 25 minutes. Then we will open the floor to your questions for a brief Q&A, and we will end around 8:15. It is my great pleasure to bring up Aileen Agopian.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. As Karen kindly introduced me, I'm Aileen Agopian, and I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you so much to New York Live, the Graduate Center, and the Middle East and Middle Eastern American Center to invite me to speak this evening about the Middle Eastern art market. A little bit about myself before I begin. I've worked in the contemporary art world a pretty long time. With a deep industry knowledge of about 20 years in the gallery and auction world collectively, I've always been focusing on building really strong contemporary collections for clients and trying to keep my finger on the pulse of what drives the international contemporary art market. Who are the market makers? Who are the artists that have it and drive and motivate us? What galleries and museums are integral to this whole process? It's a really fascinating, intricate system that all culminates in the end to amazing works of art that many times we've sold for astonishing amounts of money. But more recently, I'm really proud to have established my own company, an art advisory, Agopian Inc., and focusing my energies and passions on advising collectors to create these exciting contemporary art collections of lasting value and legacy. My professional life began quite organically. I was doing my master's in post-war and contemporary art in London, and fortuitously, I chose my dissertation topic on an artist called Mona Hatoum. She's a Palestinian Lebanese artist, And those of you not familiar with her work, she uses her body in place of a paintbrush to convey strong poetic and political work, many times about displacement, a theme really relevant in works from the Middle East. Hatoum, interestingly, never wanted to be pigeonholed and solely identified as a Lebanese or a Palestinian artist. Through her work, she always strove to have a universal connection, not reduced to her geography or her history. This universal language that Hatoum really put forward had a huge impression on me. As an Armenian with deep roots to Beirut and ones further in our history to Aleppo and Palestine, I've always looked at the world from a global perspective. And that's how I always wanted to focus my love for artists from the region, looking at my career and thinking of everything in a global way when I was doing and working in the market. So it's really during this time as a student that my mom and I were very adventurous when I was in London in 1995, and I had read about and seen the work of an artist called Damien Hirst. At the time, no one really knew who he was. I don't think we really knew who he was either, but we were fascinated by his output, and we wanted to learn more. So we called and we made a studio visit, and I go as a student, and we're looking and we're learning and we're intrigued and we're having these amazing conversations. And what I thought was a trip to go buy some paintings turned into be an interview that would set the course of my whole career. Not only did we get some amazing paintings, one of which is behind in the picture below, but I was also hired by the gallery. I think they were intrigued that this young 20-something was really, fascinated by cutting-edge art, and I was hired on the spot. So it was really Damien Hirst and the gallery that represented him at the time that were the purveyors of the young British art movement. So I seemed to be at the right place at the right time. I became sales director there, working with Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin, and Mona Hatoum, the Palestinian Lebanese artist that I had done my dissertation on. So I had the pleasure of trying to place their works in different private collections and museums around the world. After so many great years in London, I moved to New York to work at Phillips and establish their contemporary art department. I had to convince people to sell their art at this point at the auction, as well as then buy it on the flip side. It's really at Phillips that I began my career as an auctioneer, and I've been doing so ever since. So here we go on the auction podium. As an auctioneer, as Karen said, I've done sales all around the world, New York, London, through Europe, but the most interesting ones are the ones that I did in the Middle East. From Beirut to Doha and Kuwait, I can tell you that the audience was fascinating to experience, not just what they look like, but their bidding style, which was so different from those that I experienced in New York and London. After this experience at Phillips, I moved on to Sotheby's, wanting to expand my horizons even further to really work with the high end of contemporary art, working with multi-million-dollar art by Warhol and Lichtenstein. It's really at Sotheby's where I was able to nurture my passion for the Middle Eastern art market. I finally had the opportunity to really focus on the region and get my hands dirty to understand what it was that motivated this incredible market. I began to run the contemporary art auctions for Sotheby's that took place in Doha, Qatar. This would become my labor of love, where I presented works of art from Middle Eastern artists as well as other contemporary cutting-edge stars. When I first began working in the contemporary art world in London, no one paid much attention to the Middle East or artists coming out of the region. There have always been phenomenally talented artists coming out of the region. It's a place that's saturated with the most talented poet, artists, architects, writers, you name it. It's part of the DNA there. But it was really a regional market. In the wider contemporary art world in the 90s, the only artists people really thought about when they thought Middle East was Mona Hatoum and Shireen Nishat. For those of you not familiar, Shireen Nishat is an incredibly talented Iranian photographer, filmmaker, and world-famous cinematographer. That's what people associated with the Middle East in my neck of the contemporary art world. There was no mention of Dubai or of the Sharjah Biennale or the Al Thani family from Qatar for that matter. If I had brought up these areas, I have to say people in my industry would have looked at me and asked me to pull out a map. But everything really changed about a decade ago, and in 2006, it's really when the market was born in the Middle East. The Middle East participation in the international art world has increased dramatically since then. And now across the Gulf states, there are world-class museums that are being built, and there are alliances with the Louvre and the Guggenheim. In Abu Dhabi, for instance, there's art fairs blossoming in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. There's significant biennales happening in Marrakesh and Sharjah. And Qatar has emerged as quite possibly the largest buyer of Impressionist, modern, and contemporary art worldwide, not to mention in many other categories too. So what ignited this fire? The intrigue happened as a result of auctions and art fairs that started in 2006 in Dubai, really. At first, as I mentioned, you really had regional buyers. People were buying artists from their countries or from other Arab states. And as Dubai was such a hub for other regions, you had Asians, Indians, and other Europeans who started to come. Then these different biennales and the art fairs, they started to do symposiums, which intrigued more people to come and learn about art in the region. So it really was in March of 2008 that something extraordinary happened. Something clicked for the wider contemporary art world. And that was the sale in auction of a painting by this artist, at the time little known outside of the Middle East, called Farhad Moshiri. This painting was offered at Bonhams. The painting is titled Eshq, the Farsi word for love, and the painting sold for over $1 million. And guess what? The greater art world took notice. I remember it so clearly. After the sale happened, all the articles and the internet was booming with intrigue. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? Who is the buyer? And not just the buyer, but who are the people who are bidding underneath to get this price over $1 million? Then the calls started happening. Okay, Agopian, I need this artist. You gotta find it for me. I have to have it for my collection. Who else are artists that are contemporaries of Moshiri that I have to have? Who do I have to pay attention to? So with that, museums and galleries started to pay a little bit more attention, and boom, a more global market for these artists was born. But the market for Middle Eastern art is still really minuscule compared to the market for Western modern and contemporary works of art. The record for a work by a Middle Eastern artist is $2.5 million. It was paid for, it was for an Egyptian painter, Mahmoud Said, a 1929 painting. And when you think about it and you compare this to the record for Western works, we're on a completely different playing field. The new record for a Western contemporary work was established last February in 2015. The Qatari royal family paid a reported $300 million for a Paul Gauguin painting from 1892 titled in English, Will You Marry Me? It has a Tahitian title. The record prior to that was established in 2011 for a monumental Paul Cézanne painting titled The Card Players. And that sold for $250 million. And guess who the buyer was then? You got it, the Qatari royal family. When paintings of this astronomical value trade on the market, and the repeated buyers are from one of the smallest countries in the world, believe me, people start to take notice and the tides begin to shift even more. While the global contemporary art world I was part of, in our auctions, we were selling the artist Jeff Koons for over $20 million, Warhol's for over $100 million, Giacometti's. Our competitors at Christie's were selling Picasso's up to $150 million. The list goes on, multi-million, multi-million, multi-million. But the most expensive living Arab artist sold in one of my sales in Doha in 2013. It's a work by Shant Avedisian. He's an Egyptian-Armenian artist, and this is a work called Icons of the Nile, and that sold for $1.5 million, which is quite a great sum. But as you see, there's obviously a huge disconnect going on between the Middle Eastern market and the international Western one. But what's key to understand is who are the buyers and who are the bidders of works from the region, because they are no longer restricted to collectors coming from there. What I personally experienced was that early on, the bidders were buying for pride of artists from their country, supporting local talent, and then slowly starting to pay attention to artists from neighboring countries that were also addressing similar ideologies and thoughts. And later, what I found in the auctions that I ran is that the most aggressive buyers and those that were the underbidders, when it came time to this sale, came from all over the world. In the last auction I held at Sotheby's, we had bidders from 28 countries, Aggressive bidding going on from North America, from Europe, from Asia, from India, Latin America, you name it. It wasn't just artists coming out of Doha or the Middle East. This was a signal that the buyers were going on a bigger reach and they were looking abroad and understanding the importance of artists from this region. So with this awakening to a vibrant and significant art market coming, the tides in the gallery world, they felt a pull. The ears of a lot of the galleries and dealers who are already very aware and are always studious and looking for who is the most intriguing artist worldwide, began to take on more artists from the region and committed greater resources to put on shows in their galleries for them. When top dealers start to show an artist's work, there's that stamp of approval that takes place when these artists' work are hung in internationally revered galleries. Then what happens? Their works start to be hung in museums and other collectors' homes next to Warhols and Basquiat's, and a new dynamic is created. What we've witnessed is that amazing galleries throughout the US, in New York, for instance, Paula Cooper Gallery, Jack Shainman Gallery, in London, Liston Gallery, White Cube Gallery, I can keep going on with different gallery names. They really went after these artists with a passion, studying them very carefully and including them within their international stable of artists. They didn't rely on these artists just to celebrate where they're from, but they exhibited and sold these artists' works for what they were, just great creations, and they just happened to come from different parts of the world. They would have done the same for any American or Asian artist. There was nothing different. But upon saying all this, I have to mention there were a few galleries that were staying the course all throughout, and they were dedicated to pushing the platform of Middle Eastern artists. I have to mention Leila Heller Gallery. I think my friend Daniel Hamparsounian is here from there, as well as Tamer Grana Gallery, who for many years championed and exhibited these wonderful artists in New York. So another factor for the shift in the tides I have to talk about is the development in culture. It often mirrors that which is taking place in the economic world. Since countries in the Middle East were becoming more powerful financial players on a worldwide platform, it's to be expected that their underappreciated art is now given a closer look by the wider global world. In addition to the galleries, what's key is that museums, their directors, their curators were intrigued and on a mission to show more art of the region. These institutions were carefully taking note of what they missed, as there was no escaping the fact that art from the region has never received the same degree of curatorial or worldwide market attention in America as other emergent global powers. Until, I must say, the past few years, when major institutions started to show group exhibitions of Arab art and key solo museums shows of top artists from the region. Taking into account museum shows take years in the making, it's understandable that there's been a renaissance of these shows in the past 3 years, and we've seen a fantastic and powerful group of shows come about. So up until 2014, no New York museum had ever staged a significant survey of Arab contemporary art. But the new museum did it the summer of 2014. It focused a show called Here and Elsewhere, showing 45 artists from over 15 countries. The show at the new museum really tried to demystify Arab identities to a Western audience. This show received a lot of praise and some criticism, but we all must take into account that such an influential museum focused its program on artists from the Middle East. They felt a drive and a curatorial need to exhibit and expose New York and the US audience to the Arab world, and that alone speaks volumes. In the same vein, the Guggenheim made another huge statement when it showed works of Monir. Let me show you her works. It's an exhibition view. They showed the works of Monir Sharudi, Farman Farmayan, in the spring of 2015. Farman Farmayan is a 90-year-old plus Iranian artist, revered and worshipped for being one of the most important, if not the key mover and shaker, of the abstract art movement coming out of Iran, and that by a woman. Her mirrored abstract sculptures, reliefs, and paintings completely mesmerize the contemporary art world. MoMA has had a huge push of late as well for artists from the region in 2015. MoMA PS1 had a huge show devoted to the work of the talented Egyptian artist Wael Shawki. Wael is a filmmaker, artist, and sculptor, and his name is on the tip of every curator and many collectors worldwide. For his solo exhibition at a major museum, for his first solo exhibition, Shawky presented his epic video trilogy that recounts the history of the Crusades from an Arab perspective. The reviews were phenomenal, and the show was a huge success. Please don't forget Wael's name. He is and will continue to be a major player in the global art dialogue. Then MoMA, based in Manhattan, presented the first comprehensive American survey of the leading Lebanese contemporary artist, Walid Rad. Here we go, it's an exhibition view of Walid's show. It's the first time MoMA has given over its space to an Arab artist. In the show, Rad exhibited his photography, video, sculpture, and performance of the last 25 years. He knocked it out of the ballpark. Rad's work is informed by his upbringing in Lebanon during the Civil War from 75 to 91. Rad's work is completely dedicated to exploring the veracity of photographic and video documentation in the public realm, with the role of memory and narrative being key within the discourses of conflict and the construction of histories of art in the Arab world. If you didn't have a chance to see this artist's powerful show, you have an opportunity now because he has a solo show at the Paulo Cooper Gallery in Chelsea, and it is phenomenal. On the West Coast at LACMA, we don't have an image of that, but at the LA County Museum of Art, they just closed a show titled Islamic Art Now, Contemporary Art of the Middle East. It was going on for over a year. LACMA showcased the work of 25 artists with roots in the Middle East, from Shireen Nishat and Mona Hatoum to Yusuf Nabil and Lala Esadi. So as you see, key institutions are focusing their programs on the region with the goal for curators to truly explore, challenge, and open the eyes of the art-going public in the US about what a dynamic and very different group of artists are informed and coming out of the region. Tomorrow night, there's even a group show opening at BAM in Brooklyn titled The Art of Eyes Orbit, with some great artists coming out of the region. So who are some of these intriguing artists coming from the Middle East? Who are making their mark and pushing boundaries beyond their country's borders? There are many. But tonight I'm going to focus on a few I haven't already discussed. Remember, we talked about Walid Rad, Monir, Wael Shawky. I'm going to mention a few others that are on the tip of many people's lips. So get out your notebooks. In a region synonymous in popular imagination with political strife and perpetual uprising, in a region laced and fraught between conflict, between identity and cultural imposition, what I found the most interesting, and I still do, is that many of these artists, and the most significant ones, are women. I could keep going on this topic, but we'll leave that for another time. So I'm going to start and talk about a few countries of artists that we haven't discussed yet. I'm going to start with Saudi Arabia. There are many artists coming out of this country, many talented ones who are really pushing boundaries. But I want to first talk about Manal Al-Doyen. She's perhaps one of the most well-known contemporary Saudi artists. Manal's work draws its main inspiration from her own experience as a Saudi woman, questioning women's place and women's role in Saudi society through the power of cultural diplomacy in addressing politically sensitive issues. She's a photographer and a sculptor. The work you see up on the screen is incredible. It's titled Suspended Together. It's an installation of 200 fiberglass doves. On each dove, the artist has recreated the permission document which each Saudi woman needs to leave or re-enter the country. This document is issued by an appointed guardian. Manal asked her very accomplished fellow Saudi females, scientists, educators, engineers, artists. She asked them all to donate their permission slips for this piece. And the result becomes a flock of doves that appear to be in flight. However, in reality, they are suspended and not moving. Obviously, a very poetic and political statement. This work now hangs in a museum. It was sold in one of my sales in Sotheby's, and Manal's work is in many other collections worldwide. The next Saudi artist is Abdul Nasser Ghadam. He's an artist who spent over 20 years in the military in Saudi as a lieutenant colonel in the Royal Saudi Arabian Armed Forces. but he realized that art was his true calling, or is his true calling. He's another artist that makes very politically charged canvases and sculptures, using intricate geometric patterns, often covering his paintings with stamps, conveying images from Arab culture, which he intertwines with subtle messages about the way religion and authority are used to influence people. The next country I'm going to jump to is Iraq. This is one of my personal favorites as an artist and as a woman. Her name is Have Karaman. Have's work, which you see here, grapples with the space between Western and Middle Eastern cultures, aesthetics, and concepts of gender through her personal history as an Iraqi immigrant to Europe and ultimately the United States. Her paintings elegantly recall Japanese-style calligraphy, Italian Renaissance painting, and illuminated Arab manuscripts. Her paintings are very powerful and highly sought after in the commercial realm. In this painting, titled Samut Lamut, part of her most recent series she showed at Jack Shainman Gallery, Karaman focuses on the 12th century Iraqi manuscripts, illustrating personal memories she remembers her grandmother telling her from her childhood in Baghdad and later as a refugee in Sweden. Karaman has had many gallery shows and has been represented in many museum shows as well. She's a phenomenally talented artist. I'm going to cover a few more artists here. This artist, Harar Sarkisian, is from Syria, of Armenian descent. He is a brilliant photographer whose work tells stories that are not immediately visible to the surface. Focusing on photography as a means for documentary purposes, he shoots haunting and beautiful moments that are completely at odds with the socio-historical realities they conceal. What you're seeing here is part of his series, The Execution Squares. In this series, he's depicting public execution squares in 3 Syrian cities, Aleppo, Latakia, and later Damascus. Taken in the early morning hours, the time the executions usually take place, the quiet images reveal a fragile paradox as the sad political circumstances and reality of what occurred has been completely obscured. Harar's work hangs in the Tate, in Sharjah Foundation, in the Mori Museum, in many key institutions, and in many important private collections. So I'm going to cover 2 more countries. Ali Bani Sadr is from Iran. He now lives in New York. Again, one of my absolute favorite artists, someone whose work I'm completely committed to and a champion of. Ali's work is found hanging in the Met, the British Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA, the Albright Knox, the Francois Pinault collection. The list can keep going on and on. His paintings, for me, they transport you to another time. This painting called The Gatekeeper, for instance. These works are really influenced by his experience as a refugee from the Iran-Iraq War, and his approach to abstraction evokes connotations to memory and nostalgia in these fantastical, rich landscapes of jewel-tone colors. His canvases pulsate with energy, and they breathe life. The final country I'm going to cover, a few artists from, is Lebanon. I already spoke about one of my favorites, Walid Rad. So now I want to talk about 2 extraordinary Lebanese artists who are both women and who are both over 90 years old and who are both commercial market makers. The first one is Atel Adnan. She's an abstract painter and celebrated poet and novelist. She's 91 years old, so it's quite impressive. She's long been considered one of the leading voices of contemporary Arab American culture. In the past few years, she's had incredible shows from New York to London. She's been included even in the Whitney Biennale. She is very devoted to her painterly practice, painting on an intimate scale, using a palette knife. She applies the paint directly from the tube onto her knife and thickly applies it onto the canvas to create these gorgeous abstract landscapes. Another artist from Lebanon who is so impressive, and the final artist that I'm going to cover this evening, is Salwa Rada Shuker, and this is an exhibition view of her show at the Tate. She had her first major museum show anywhere in the world in 2013 at the Tate in London at the age of 97. Impressive. Then she recently had her first US gallery show at CRG Gallery this past fall. This remarkable artist is considered a pioneer of abstract art in the Middle East. From painting to sculpture, her diverse works are saturated by her interest in science, math, and Islamic art and poetry. She is a force to be reckoned with, and one that the commercial market is now taking very close look at. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to move over to speak with David Joselit. We're going to be talking a little bit more, and I look forward afterward to hearing and answering your questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that super illuminating
Thank you.
and exciting talk. I want to ask you first a little bit about the broader context in Doha, because you've had such an amazing history there, and you brought up the museum situation there, which is quite interesting, that people may not all be aware of, that there is a very important Islamic museum, a historical museum, there's a contemporary museum, and then there's several others in the authority, correct?
Yes, there are several other.
There's even an Orientalist museum.
Yes, that's correct. And the Islamic Museum is it's a treasure that Tadeo Ando built.
So I wonder if you could just say a bit more about what you know about the kind of strategy and policy of museum building there, what its objectives are in terms of building local culture and national profile, and also maybe in doing that, think about how contemporary art particularly fits within that much broader cultural program.
Well, I think we can look at Doha, and we have to obviously talk about Abu Dhabi, where the Louvre and the Guggenheim and so many different major architects have been invited to build these phenomenal architectural structures. And think about that the region is really trying to make the world take note and pay attention and make them a force to be reckoned with on many different levels. Doha in particular, it has the beautiful Islamic Museum, it has Mataf as well, and many different other museum and gallery hubs within the authority, the Qatar Museum Authority. And I think what is fascinating, especially by Qatar and the royal family, is that they have been buying Islamic art for many years, and they have been deeply committed to buying contemporary art. They try very hard to fly under the radar, but when you're spending at the level that they're spending, the word will come out in one way or other, as we've seen, not just in the Gauguin and the different works that have sold recently. They have been very active auction participants, and what's intriguing is the works that they have bought, you won't always see in the museum, so they really make a concerted effort to celebrate a collection that is their own personal one, which is kept for their, under their strict guidance, and everyone is not privy to that. And then one to show and expose the wider audience in Doha and really attract a bigger international audience as well, to come in by putting big shows. They had a show by Takashi Murakami. They had a big show by Damien Hirst. They've had other shows by Boetti. So they're really trying to speak to all different parts and facets of the contemporary art world to intrigue people of all different practices and passions in contemporary art and draw them into their country. Right now they have a New York Times huge symposium. They even have major architects, Jeff Koons is there, which will be happening the following week, again, to draw a big audience and pull people in to understand what a culturally rich country that they are trying to be.
Mm-hmm. I can't pull back from asking a slightly more prickly question maybe about, you mentioned the museums in Abu Dhabi, and as I'm sure you know, there's been quite a lot of criticism about the labor practices in those museums, et cetera.
Much so.
How do you see the art world intersecting with those questions of migrant labor and...
I think those are so key to what is happening in the world. We have to be sensitive, and we have to understand the plight of what these workers are undergoing. And we have to look at a bigger picture of what is, in truth, the most significant thing, and these are these people's health and their lives. And yes, we want these beautiful institutions, but they're at what price? So I'm happy that people are making such a concerted push and bringing these issues out to the fore to bring them to light. It's very important. This would not people would not stand for this in America, and they shouldn't stand for it in the Middle East as well.
I mean, it is interesting that Walid Rad, whom you mentioned, is one of the most high-profile members of Gulf Labor and various other organizations that have been
Yes.
involved. So there has been, quite a strong reaction among individual artists, I know.
Which is great. People have to take a stand to make a difference. I mean,
Right.
that's,
But in Doha, when I visited there, I was quite interested by how the different museums were very much in different locations and seemed to be addressing different publics. If I'm not mistaken, the Contemporary Museum was near the education,
Yes.
this sort of university neighborhood, whereas the Islamic Museum was very much a very central. Public, a wonderful place with parks around and stuff. It made me wonder, actually, if contemporary art is seen somehow as in the realm of education, or it's coded differently, whether you have some insight into that kind of.
I think for them at the time now, the museum is actually moving. I think that was being used as a facility
So that's
to
temporary.
showcase. That was temporary.
okay. So
It's still there now, but
Okay.
yeah, it's still there.
So there's no big argument to be made out of that. I was really intrigued and interested by what you said about women artists
Yes.
Across the Islamic world or the Arab world, because as you know, there is a kind of argument often on the left that secular Western values need to address Islam's sort of oppression of women, et cetera, et cetera. And so it might be a surprise for people to know that there are such prominent and interesting works being done by women in these countries. So I wondered if you could maybe elaborate on that and even talk about what the sort of context is for them in terms of education, exhibition, that kind of thing.
I think many of these female artists are using it as their platform to really get their message across, to show, that yes, they come from regimes that, there is not gender equality. There is, there are these bigger issues, and they're not afraid to challenge what I think we as an audience would think they would be a bit fearful to, challenge and take on these really big thematics in their work in such a public way. And someone like the artist I had shown, Manal Al-Doyan, who had the doves, she was even invited by the Clinton Library. She spoke with Bill Clinton in a big symposium about this whole message. And so for them, it is their platform to get to get the message out that yes, they come from these difficult regimes, but there's so much creative energy that they're not scared to challenge, they're not scared to expose, they're not scared to put themselves forward, and they do so with passion and vigor. And it's fascinating that across the board, not just Saudi, there's Iran, Syria, Lebanon, I mean, there are talented women that are also in Egypt that are showcased there, and if there are different issues, you know what? They work around it, and they'll get their work shown somewhere else in Europe to really get the word out. So I think that, coming to it, that is not what I would have perceived, but being a part of it, I saw, these women are incredible. They're putting themselves out there. They're not fearful. They're standing up tall, and they're creating the work they want to create. They're not letting anybody subject them to otherwise.
And are they showing in their home countries as well?
Some of them do. I mean, I think obviously there are issues. There's the Egyptian artist Ghada Amer, whose paintings have a sexual nature and who many years had a very difficult time going to Egypt, did not show her work. It really depends on the country and their religious beliefs and affiliations. Doing a sale in Doha and even showing work in Dubai, we always had to be sensitive. There could be no nudity sent, whether it's by a male artist or a female artist. So you do have to be sensitive because your works will not get through customs. So within reason, I think, artists have shown in Saudi. There's a celebration that always happens in Jeddah now every year, and there are many male and female artists, showing and exhibiting their challenging works.
How do you conduct your research across this really rather not only geographically vast territory, but really politically
it's fascinating. Yeah, it's very different. And I mean, what it's very true. And what I work in the wider contemporary world, you don't see a lot of these artists all the time in the big auctions that Sotheby's and Christie's have in New York and in London. So it's drawing in slowly these different artists. And I think for me, it's very important to see which galleries are showing, museums. I'm out whenever I can, I go to the Dubai at least for the past, I think, 6 years, going out there. I've gone to Kuwait, all different parts.
To the art fair
Well,
in
to the
Dubai,
art fair,
and
or
also
going and
Sharjah.
visiting those different cities when there are
Oh, okay.
symposiums, when there are different art events happening, to really learn, to meet the artists, to engage with collectors, to learn from the different museum curators, and really have an open dialogue. What I think is very smart that happens in the Middle East, especially in the beginning, is they hosted many symposiums. And that drew such a wide audience because we all want to learn. We still want to learn. I mean, we're still learning. So you have to put yourself out there, go, see, read as much as you can, meet the artists, because I think that's the most fascinating part, to engage with our contemporaries and understand what it is that's motivating them. So,
How would you say approximately what percentage of the artists you're working with are living in Europe or in the U.S.?
it's such a mix, such a mix. Maybe if they do, live in the Middle East, they'll do residencies abroad, whether it's in America, in Europe, or different parts of the world. So it's tough. I mean, when you think about the new museum show, that they had 45 artists from 15 different countries who are living all over the world.
Right.
Very few that still really live within the Middle East. So it's such a mix. I mean, we're such a big diaspora everywhere. I couldn't say specifically.
But in your own work, both at Sotheby's and now in your own business, do you find an interest on your own part and on the the collectors you're working with in Arab American art as well?
Very much so.
Kind of complementary.
Very much so, very much so. I mean, so many of the people that I work with have this great dialogue. They collect Warhol and they collect many of the artists that you've seen there and, many other ones. So it just really, how people look at it as these are intriguing artists who happen to come from a very interesting part of the world. And yes, their histories color what they're making. They don't always, though, necessarily are what they are because they're Lebanese or because they're Iraqi. That's a part of their history that has some kind of an influence on what their practice is.
Right. One thing that you said that really struck me was you seem to make an argument that the market really began with the kind of astounding sale of Farhad Mashiri. Mashiri.
Yes.
I can't read my own writing. And that interests me, if you could say a little bit about how it is almost the market that makes the market through
Yes.
the price, and what does that say about, it sort of makes someone like me who's an art historian who thinks in terms of, visual genealogy.
Of course.
Think, maybe that's completely irrelevant
Well,
on some level.
it's true, but what happens is, before that sale happened, people in my world on the sales, they never really paid attention to what was happening in Dubai. They didn't really look at too many artists coming out of Iran or Lebanon. That was work that happened over there. Mm-hmm. It wasn't art that was integrated within the wider platform of the contemporary auctions or what the galleries were doing. There were a few galleries working with contemporary artists from the region, but it wasn't a draw. People weren't talking about that. But what that sale did was people thought, what in the world? $1 million Iranian artist we've never heard of? How does that happen, And that happened a lot with the Indian market as well. When the Indian contemporary market had a boom, a few paintings were selling for astronomical figures. It's unfortunate it has to be a dollar amount that wakes people up sometimes, but it is what it is. There was something that was a trigger. There needed to be a bit of a trigger.
It's not just that someone, oh my God, it cost $1 million, I want one too. It's more.
Well, there was a little bit. There's always a herd mentality, a
Right.
little bit with certain type of collectors. That is definitely going to happen.
Right.
But that is not the only thing.
No, you're saying that in a way it was a spur toward curiosity and more research.
Exactly. It was intrigue.
Also, the kind of story you're telling suggests that the museum comes after the market when it comes to kind of a global.
I think the museums we're always there, but as you know, museum shows are years in the making.
True.
Research, travel, meeting the artists, finding the work. This is not something that happens overnight. But it's fascinating that New York, who has the most incredible museums around had never had a show focusing on Arab works. I mean, it happened in 2014. They were incorporated in different group shows, but no one had ever committed a space that they'll normally commit to a very commercially viable artist. And they did it. That's great. That says something. They were obviously working on these things. They don't happen over 2-3 years. I'm sure it was 10, 15 years in the making, a lot of this. And a lot of galleries were, they were very perceptive, and a lot of clever galleries were looking at the region already, and a lot of key galleries that we have that, that make so much of what our contemporary art market is, but not everyone. It was really more of a bigger eye-opening experience, I think, for other people to say, hey, wait a second, we got to pull back and look at the bigger picture here. We can't be so narrow-focused and thinking that work coming from there is just a regional thing.
What have been the kind of crucial galleries outside of the region that have helped to raise the profile of these artists?
Well, a few I had mentioned. I mean, there's Layla Heller Gallery, who's been around in New York for many, many years. But a lot of key galleries as well in New York. There's Jack Shainman Gallery, there's Paula Cooper Gallery, Listen Gallery in London as well, White Cube Gallery. There are many artists and many galleries who were looking and showing these, Alexander Bonin. I mean, all these galleries are sort of flying into my head that were showing artists here and there and never just saying, okay, this is now the work of the Lebanese artist so-and-so.
Right.
And I love that's what they were doing. That was part of the press release, but it never was, we're showing this artist just because they're from where they're from.
I want to spend a few minutes on a slightly different kind of topic, more a professional one. I'm curious, I mean, I don't want you to reveal any trade secrets or anything like that, but I think it might be interesting to know a little bit about how you work with a client to build a collection, how you kind of draw from people the kind of work that they might want to have, and to build a collection that I assume that you also work toward one that has a certain kind of significance.
Of course,
and perhaps,
very much so.
Might end up in a public space.
Very much so. I mean, that's really the goal. And, now that I've left and I'm really full-time focusing on advising clients, I was always doing this, but now really focusing on building their collections. It's really sitting down and understanding what their vision is and trying to help punctuate that vision with other artists maybe they hadn't considered, to give a more holistic view of contemporary art and maybe the era they're collecting or the specific movement that they're collecting. And for me, the first step is really education and really taking them to galleries, taking them to museums, sending them books that I think are intriguing, always sending them articles about artists that I think you got to pay attention to this person. You might not like it, but just understand why they're important, and then we can determine whether that fits in or it doesn't. So for me, the first step a lot is education and trying to understand also for me what motivates them and what moves them and what they're passionate about, because in the end of the day, you want to love what you're collecting. You want to be excited. It becomes part of who you are when you have things on your wall. You're proud, and it says something about what your aesthetic is as well. When we're building, as I am with somebody, building something to hopefully donate to a museum, that we're working a little bit more with a curator to make sure that we're filling in the holes of what the vision for that institution is, while at the same time punctuating it with the identity of the collectors. So it's a very back and forth, it's a very open process, and I like to think of myself as a guide, and when I'm working with people, I always think of that collection as something I would do for myself. So it's a fun process. This past week we had art fairs and we were running around at all the galleries and looking at different things, in addition to what we would do normally with museums and galleries. So it's a very hands-on process.
There has been a lot of interest in art history, and I think also several museum projects have begun as well, and what's sometimes called global modernisms. I had a student when I was at Yale who wrote her dissertation on early 20th century Egyptian art, for instance. And
Great.
I'm wondering if you're working, if you're interested in that kind of longer arc of history as well, which which can really give a perspective on contemporary artists, and
Very
whether
much
there's
so.
a market for that actually
Well,
too. I mean,
there is a big market for modern works from the region. I mean, that's really where
you mentioned that.
Mahmoud Said, for instance, is just one example, the Egyptian artist. But that really is where the bigger ticket items are, because those works are harder to find. The
Right.
really classic, the really important, compelling works from these artists, you know, they're squirreled away in different collections and they're not as well documented to be able to track down and find. And yes, definitely, that's the root. You know, it's always looking back and seeing the root of where so many of these contemporary artists are coming from. So it's great if a collector wants to do that. I would love to do it. But my focus traditionally is the post-war and the contemporary world.
And you mentioned the conflict in the region, and I wonder how that's unsettled art infrastructure in various places. Like Syria, for instance. Lebanon, I guess, is in good shape at the moment, or at least semi-good shape.
Well, what you found, especially with Syria, for instance, is unfortunately so many of the artists fled. Many, as we know, there are so many refugees, and there are many people who have gone to Lebanon. And a community of Syrian artists has really been burgeoning in Lebanon now. You know, they're doing what they have to do. And what we're going to see, maybe not now, but I think in the years to come, is the repercussions of these different political atrocities and difficulties that are going to take some type of formation in their work. And there's going to be a very emotionally powerful body of work that's going to be coming out of a lot of these artists.
I mean, do you see that starting already? I mean, people like Walid Rad, for instance, for years has
It's
actually
been forever he's been doing. I mean, that's part of his practice.
And the photographer you showed as well.
Exactly,
Very
Harar
powerful
Sarkisian.
work.
So definitely is something that it's not a new phenomenon whatsoever. It is something that many of these artists inform their work.
Are there other visual trends that you think are particularly interesting or important that are shared in the region, and shared with artists working elsewhere as well, that make them, you know, susceptible, let's say, to being placed beside the artists you mentioned, Warhol, whatever, Damien Hirst, the other?
You know, I think when I tried to choose artists, I tried to choose in all different types of media, all different types of thematic, also aesthetic, to really convey that message that we can't just say the work is informed by political difficulties. There are so many other things aside from just gender or what the history that they've gone through. Some are fascinated by Persian manuscripts or, you know, different architectonic ideologies and theories. There are all these different, I guess, thematics that you can find that you can't just say there's only one. It's kind of like, it's difficult to say what's American art or what's European art. They have all these different facets that cover all different types and thematics that are out there. And I think the same applies really for the Middle East.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I'm going to ask you just one more question, and then we'll open to the audience. Why do you think contemporary art has gotten so much more prominent in recent years? It used to be, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when there was barely even an academic field that was legitimately contemporary art, and now we have more graduate students applying
That's so true.
than any other field, and it's really the balance has shifted so dramatically. And one of the explanations we often think about is that, of course, it's very present, and the market has actually been very helpful in you know, bringing a lot of material into high visibility. But I wonder if you have a particular point of view on this.
I think it's so true what you said. I mean, when I studied my master's, I had to go to London. It was the only program that had a post-war and contemporary master's program. The US didn't even have one yet. And why I think contemporary art has really come to the fore and has intrigued so many people is Impressionist and modern work was it. You know, in the 80s and the 90s, there were the, you know, $80, $90 million Van Goghs selling. And what happens is so many of these modern and Impressionist works became in museum collections and foundations that it was very difficult to get fresh material. So here comes contemporary works, which when you looked at comparison prior, didn't look so expensive. But now, because you can source so many top caliber works by all of these incredible artists from Rothko, Pollock, you name it, you can find these works and they can trade on the market. There's an excitement. people are part of something. And then the newspaper and the internet plays a huge role. I mean, the internet, auctions prior to the 90s were all dealers. It was never collectors. People didn't sit, there was never press at a row writing furiously who's bidding and buying on what, and everyone ripping open the New York Times the next day to figure out what it was. But that's happened now, and that's had another big impact on the contemporary art world. But in the end of the day, it has to do with accessibility. And contemporary art and post-war work was more accessible after a certain time. There weren't as many of the treasures in museum collections. There was more that, as an auction person, we can suss out and convince people to sell and present it on the public market. So I think that played a huge factor.
Mm-hmm. When you were at Sotheby's, did you ever work with living artists directly, or that's not
We
done?
didn't. It's always secondary. So it's we worked with them if, again, we were always really interested. We would do studio visits with collectors, meet the artists, talk about their work with the different collectors, but we didn't specifically handle an auction.
Right.
Now I can do that, which is a great pleasure and a bonus.
That does sound good.
Yeah.
So I'm going to keep to my word and move to the audience. Are there questions? Yes. I think there are microphones on either aisle, so please use them so people can hear.
Hello, thank you for this very inspiring overview. My name is Adham Hafiz. I'm an Egyptian choreographer and co-curator of the Live Ideas Festival. And coming from Cairo, a city with centuries old, if not millennia, history when it comes to art and poetry and architecture, and looking at the market now and also looking academically how art from the Arab region is dealt with as if it either happened the last 5 years ago with Arab Spring and it's youthful and political, or it is very expensive objects that are acquired by royal elite members of Gulfi families and the museums that are there. Museums in cities younger than many of the artists that you've listed in your fantastic presentation. In your role as an expert, how do you help play an active, how do you complexify the way the work coming from this region is seen? How do you, not in an essentialist way, because at the same time most of this work developed in very intense conversations. I mean, the Egyptian surrealism with Breton and Trotsky.
Very much so, yeah.
And also, it's a double question, perhaps David should be answering this. Is it perhaps the role of the academy also to start looking outside of its canon on what resides outside of the canon, even if it doesn't look very canonic in the sense of Western artistic practices? Thank you.
I think for me, and I can speak to that, while I was in the auction industry, I always made a concerted effort to bring these artists' works in the auctions that we would hold in New York and in London. So that's a normal, for instance, that type of work was not included in those sales. It was always very regional, whether it was offered in Doha or Dubai. So slowly bringing the artists in so that different clients would come and be intrigued and learn about the works. Or we also had hosted different exhibitions at Sotheby's as well that had mixed exhibitions and thematics, and bringing in these artists that maybe we wouldn't traditionally think of to include. So engaging people in dialogue to understand that it's not just Pollock or Lichtenstein or what, that there's Wael Shawki, there's Youssef Nabil, that there's these brilliant artists from whatever part of the world. And for me personally, how I try is different talks, is when I'm talking to collectors or showing them work, I'm always mixing it up, whether it's Middle Eastern, Indian, Latin American, American. I look at it and I really try to always get the message out that it's a global platform, and that's the way that we have to play it. Yes, museums have to show it in a more quote-unquote ghettoized way that this is Arab art, but it has to be done as a first step to expose people. So, I'm sure David could speak of more the academic angle for it. But in terms of a market sense, that's what I feel.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think it's, and have been working to do this in my own work, think it's super important to broaden the canon. I mean, I'm not sure I would say broaden the canon, but maybe undo the idea of a canon, or, broaden how one understands the practice of art globally. But the problem, the kind of structural problem, is that since academic research is based on deep expertise, people always feel like they're walking out on a tightrope, or whatever the expression is, out on a limb if you're outside of your area of expertise. So I've decided personally that that's worth the risk. It doesn't mean not trying to do due diligence, but but in order to make some kind of synthetic arguments, somebody's got to decide that, you have to break through a certain kind of area studies boundary, and then hopefully that will lead to other kind of strategies and methods, that will combine area studies and also a kind of global model. Other questions? In the back, and then sorry.
Just a short question. Middle Eastern, do you consider Israel or Palestine, Palestinians part of this, or is this just the Arab world?
Well, I think that can be a very big definition. And I think that is a very difficult thing. We were talking about earlier, what do you coin the area? And as you saw in my talk, I said Middle East. I didn't say MENA, North Africa. It's a very difficult subject, obviously, because of all the political implications.
Right.
And it is a region. I personally look at it as a region, whether you want to consider it, art from Israel, Palestine. Yes, it is within the region. But so much has been said about, do we coin it as the Arab world? Do we, but then how can you just say Arab world? Do we say American art is just American? You're missing out on so much. So it's a very difficult line and thing to define. And maybe in a few more years when people can look back, like, coining the phrase minimalism or abstract expressionism, someone will hopefully be able to, canonize or give a proper terminology for art from the region.
No, I was just asking because basically it was the Arab world.
More so, yes.
Right.
Well, there is Iran, which is,
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So I guess what we'll do is, if you have a question, you should walk, as this gentleman has done, to one of the microphones. So I guess you're next.
Thank you. Thank you both. This has been really demystifying for me. I'm actually a collage artist. I'm originally from Cleveland, but I have Lebanese roots. I do a lot of street art tours that mix in street art and graffiti with the quote-unquote fine art world, especially on the Lower East Side. I'm wondering the role of street art, if any, or if there are certain street artists in the Middle Eastern world that you deal with or that you recommend. I know El Cid
I was just going to say El Cid,
is one that I see on the Lower East Side. And Layla Heller Gallery, they show graffiti and street artists, but I'll leave it to you and you if you,
Well, I would have suggested El Cid for you as well, to tell you to look at that. But I'm sure that will be a thematic that's going to be fleshed out even more in the years to come.
But as far as auction houses, do you deal with street artists at all, or very much, or?
They do somewhat. There's always that difficult line because, like for instance, with the British artist Banksy, the work, is it part of who owns it? Who has the right to sell it? There are all these different nuances that I think are associated with street art. Visually, yes, depends if it's a painting, if it's on an actual canvas, but there are so many different legalities and different things which come up, which arise with street art. So I think that's where it's a little bit of a tricky situation. Auction houses do, if everything is in line, if everything adds up and, is correct to offer.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good evening, and Bari Gereko. Thank you, Aileen, for your talk, and special thanks for mentioning that many female artists. You mentioned a few Armenian artists from Middle East. My question is, do you keep an eye on what's going on in Armenia in terms of contemporary art, and are there any names that we should know?
I think there are wonderful Armenian artists. There are obviously Armenians all throughout the diaspora, all over the world. And, everybody's roots, in essence, we all come from Armenia. We just happen to live in all different parts of the world now. There are wonderful artists coming in Armenia. There are many, Grigorian, Rumelian, Hamalbashian. There are many that are working. and focusing and creating a beautiful practice. You know, I personally don't focus as much. I look at the Armenian artists that are within our diaspora, obviously those that are in the Middle East as well. So if they happen to come from Armenia, that's great as well. Thank you. Thank you.
I should have warned my daughter about this question. I'm sorry, I did not think about it.
I could have prepped, Dad, come on.
The question is, in the Western contemporary art, a lot of the artists have sexual orientation, which is quite prominent. What about the sexual orientation of the artists from the Middle East?
That's a very interesting question. But it is obviously a very relevant topic. And what happens is there are a lot of artists who are of whichever sexual preference, gay, bisexual, lesbian, that are very vocal and that are out. They may not be as vocal within their own countries, depending on the political implications of their statements. But you know, there are many of them living within the diaspora, making work that's very challenging sexually, and making statements about sexual orientation and different things like that. And you know, coming from the Middle East, that's a very courageous thing to do, because as we know, there isn't as much equality and open-mindedness when it comes time to sexual orientation. That is not what everybody is accustomed to. So there are many artists, there are many vocal artists, and there are some that unfortunately choose not to be, but it is something that is very welcome and very understood, and exhibited as well.
Okay, another one coming. We have time for a couple more.
Hi, quick question. You mentioned in Doha in particular, there is also a museum devoted to Orientalist art. So I guess besides collecting the great masterpieces of the 19th century, as well as contemporary from locals or expatriate artists, this collection of the Orientalist art is an interesting phenomenon. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that.
As I was mentioning to you, the Qatari royal family is very active in, I would say, almost every category that many auction houses run. Islamic and Orientalist is one of them. And that is part of one of their collecting passions. Obviously, they have deep pockets, so they can be quite aggressive when it comes time to putting together very key collections. And I think what's great is that they put them on exhibit for the rest of the world to see as well, these very iconic works.
Another question? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you.